In your booklet of reports, in the white pages, you will notice the committees and personnel for this assembly. There are, I understand, a couple of corrections to be made to this list that we will get to you at a later time. Backman has just told you how to identify the resolution committee. We would also like to tell you that the Synod Council have stars on their name tags, so they can also be readily identified. We thank the following personnel: Dr. Backman Brown for parliamentarian, Romania Klein for liturgical coordinator, and Chief Page, Mrs. Ruth Ledbetter. There will be child care available. It is in the Crumley Center. It is available during the business sessions and for Friday evening worship and Sunday morning worship. The bishop's assistants and staff are here now, and I would like to recognize them at this time. If they would just please stand. Reverend George Ryan, Reverend Beth Kearney, Dr. Jane Mitchum, and Dr. Leonard Bullock. To my right and assisting here and keeping minutes is our Synod Secretary, Pastor Ron Fink. And the other officer of the Synod, Mr. H.D. Fry. In the background, and maybe not in here, but we will at least see who's here. From the support staff at the Synod headquarters, we have Mrs. Cookie Elston, Mrs. Catherine Fink, Mrs. Iris McCullough, Mr. Tony Sherrill, Mrs. Melanie Bookout, Mrs. Glenda Ball, and the Youth Ministry Coordinator, Tammy Joan West. Not with us is Peggy Bollinger from that office. We also have a new person here, just one more. Is Melissa Warren in here? Well, Melissa's the one you'll see with the telephone in her hand. This is a new position this year. We have hired a temporary assembly coordinator, and you will, I'm sure, see Melissa around. We'll try to get her in here later to meet the group. At this time, I'd like to call on Dr. Ryan LaHurd, President of Lenore College, for a welcome.
Thank you. I'm honored to be able to welcome Bishop Anderson, the members of the North Carolina Synod Assembly, and guests to the Lenore College campus, your college, for the 1996 Synod Assembly. I am pleased to report to you that the college has had a very positive year. The worship, prayer, and community life of the campus continues to grow. We have made significant physical improvements in the campus. You will see some of these improvements are underway in the bookstore and snack bar area of the Cromer Center and across 7th Avenue, where our new admissions and financial aid building is being constructed. Today we complete our 4th consecutive fiscal year with a budget surplus, and our faculty and students continue to garner awards and recognition around the state and the nation. Like most colleges, however, a successful year is no promise of future success. We continue to struggle to stay faithful to our mission while keeping costs down, enrollments up, and budgets balanced. Our current strengths and successes have depended in large part on the support of the North Carolina Synod corporately and its members individually. Recently, the president of the Charles F. Kettering Foundation, David Matthews, writing about the problems with our country's public schools, noted that the trouble with the public schools is that they no longer have a public which considers them to be their schools. I would argue that a college of the church cannot exist as a college of the church unless there is a church that sees that college as its own. We are gratified that the Synod, through its prayers, interest, financial support, and by encouraging its youth to study here, have made a commitment that helps to keep us strong as the College of the North Carolina Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. We thank you. We are pleased to have you on the campus, We hope your stay here will be pleasant, and we pray God's guidance for this assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Representing our host congregations, Beth Eden Newton and Old St. Paul's Newton, are the Reverend Dr. Bill Manise, Reverend Scott Bollinger, and the Reverend David Ridenauer.
I'm David Ridenauer. I'm pastor of Old St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Newton, and as a word of introduction, we're the congregation that celebrated our bicentennial 19 years before the United States did. We were founded in 1757. We're in our fourth building, and we're proud to say our third building is still standing. We still use it occasionally for worship, and it's open every weekend for tours. And we invite you to come and see us sometime. Old as we are, this is a first for us. This is the first time we've ever had the opportunity to co-host this event, and it's our pleasure. And we greet you and hope that we can make your stay in Hickory more enjoyable. Dr. Mims.
It's also the privilege of Beth Eden Church in Newton to welcome you to this assembly. Beth Eden is a much, much younger sister to Old St. Paul's. We have been her neighbor for only the last 146 years. My members have asked me to tell you that even though we're 146 years old, we don't look a day over 125. Bishop Anderson was my church history professor when I was in seminary, so I get a chance to show off for him, let him know I'm still studying my church history a little bit. In the last century, Beth Eden and Old St. Paul's were both members of the Tennessee Synod. But then we went our separate ways, and for most of this century, we have been in different denominations. While we've certainly not been enemies, we've had very little to do with each other, even though we're less than a mile apart. But all of that has changed in the last few years. Our youth groups have done some joint activities, as have our men's organizations, and now we have this opportunity to co-host the assembly. We are enjoying being neighbors to each other, and we're thrilled to welcome you to our neighborhood this weekend.
One other connection that Old St. Paul's and Beth Eden have is me. I was baptized at Old St. Paul's as an infant and now serve as pastor at Beth Eden. In Proverbs, there is that saying about the ant. Consider the ant and how busy the ant is in the spring and summer. Well, I've looked at some of our folks who are hosts today, and I see they are as busy as ants. The folks who helped register and the pages, the people that put the packets together for you. I would like to thank Margaret Setzer of Old St. Paul's for her help in organizing the people of Old St. Paul's, and Isaac and Gilda Kuhn for organizing the people of Beth Eden. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you, and thanks to the volunteers as well. We couldn't do this without them. At this time, we are very pleased to be receiving a new congregation. Pastor George Ryan, would you like to introduce them?
Good afternoon. As the bishop's liaison to the outreach committee, it's an honor for me to introduce to you Reverend Carl Haynes, who is the chair of our outreach committee and who will present this new congregation to you. Carl.
Vice President Ashton, Bishop Anderson, pastors, delegates of the North Carolina Synod, it is my privilege to present to you Trinity Lutheran Church, Rocky Mount, to this assembly for reception into the North Carolina Synod. The pastors are the Reverend George Simmons and Pastor Jeff Hoffner. Trinity is a merger between Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church and the Church of the Resurrection. This time, I would like to introduce John Fleming, a member of Trinity.
Thank you, Carl. I'd like to ask all the members from Trinity Rocky Mount who are here, please, to come up and join me on stage. I got selected to make the comments for the congregation this morning because I was the only one not in the car on the way up this morning. We have present with us from our congregation our two pastors, as it said, Pastor Jeff Hoffner and Pastor George Simmons. In addition, we have Vivian Anderson, James and Flossie Dunstan, and Sharon Fick, plus many more that we left behind in Rocky Mount. This has been a long road for us. We've been working on this merger for some 4 or 5 years, and as Carl said, it is a product of a merger between the two Lutheran churches in Rocky Mount, Trinity Evangelical Lutheran and Church of the Resurrection Lutheran. Right now, we're one of, I guess, a few congregations who are worshiping out of 2 facilities, and we're still working to pull all this together, but I think it's working very well for us. We want to mention several people and with our thanks in helping pull this together for us. This was especially an effort and started by Bishop Mark Manise, and we also thank his assistants, especially Pastor Leonard Bolick, Pastor George Ryan, to help us work through all of the procedure and everything else that went together to pull this together. In addition to that, Pastor Boyce Whitener was a big help to us. Pastor Michael Went came and helped us with some counseling. And Dr. Bachman Brown, of course, helped us with all the legal parts of it, which needed to be pulled together. So we owe everybody a big thanks. And we're glad to be together as one congregation for you here at this Synod Assembly. Thank you.
On behalf of the Synod and the entire Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, I want to congratulate the members and pastors of these congregations and this congregation. The two have become one, and we salute you for that sign of reconciliation and mutual commitment, and look forward to a long and fruitful marriage and part of this synodical family.
Thank you, Bishop Anderson. At this time, I would like Bishop Anderson to please introduce our keynote speaker.
It's indeed a pleasure to recognize and to have the opportunity to introduce Scott Hendricks, who is, as many of you know, a native of South Carolina, a graduate of Duke University here in North Carolina, and a graduate of Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary. Scott Hendricks has spent many years in this part of the country, but he also holds the distinction, in my mind at least, of being the only person I know who has ever served as professor of church history at the 3 Eastern seminaries of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, not only at Southern, but also at Philadelphia and currently at Gettysburg Seminary. From 1988 to 1994, Scott began a new phase of his interests. he studied and practiced family therapy in Philadelphia, and during that time taught a course with Dr. Leroy Aden of the Philadelphia Seminary on pastoral care of the family. Scott is a clinical member of the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy and still engages in therapy and supervision work. So you have a unique combination in Scott Hendricks. On the one hand, an internationally known Luther scholar, and on the other, a sensitive and skilled family therapist. Lately, in most of his writing and research, Scott seeks to combine these two disciplines, family studies and religious history. His most recent publications in this area include articles like Beyond Erickson. That's not Leif Erikson, that's Eric Erickson. I'm a little more sensitive to ethnic references than I used to be that way. Beyond Erickson, The Relational Luther is the full title. Masculinity and Patriarchy in the German Reformation, and Loyalty, Piety, and Opportunism, German Princes and the Reformation. As you can see, Scott is breaking new ground here, and it's being followed with interest. Last summer, he conducted research on the influence of family loyalties on the Calvinist Reformation in Geneva. A collection of his earlier articles will appear this summer under the title Tradition and Authority in the Reformation. So it is with a good deal of personal pleasure, and certainly on behalf of all of you, that I say, Dr. Hendricks, welcome back. You're among home folks here, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, George. I had not expected to be introduced by the bishop of the church, and therefore I feel almost like I need to give an immediate disclaimer, like you read in the prefaces of books, that any mistakes that follow in this presentation are solely my responsibility and not the responsibility of the person who introduced me or the organization which he represents. George was also my church history professor, Bishop Anderson was. And my pastoral care professor is also present. Dr. Austin Schell is a member of the North Carolina Synod, and I did not realize that I would be giving this address before both of them. So I am properly humbled and nervous. But nevertheless, I'm very happy to be here among friends, among colleagues, among former students, among all the members, delegates, visitors to the North Carolina Synod. It's good to be back in the South. And it's good to see so many of you again. Some of you have sat through my lectures before when I taught at Southern Seminary. It's nice of you to come back and sit through one more. I applaud your endurance and appreciate the welcome that I have received here. When Beth Kearney invited me to give these presentations, she was so gracious and disarming that I accepted before I really thought about the theme of the assembly. It sounded good, you know, like a good assembly theme should. Current, positive, even obvious. Hope for the world, the gift of family. Now, who can dispute that? You don't have to be a therapist or a historian, however, to realize that some statements are less obvious than they seem, especially when you first hear them. You know, like the answer of Willie the bank robber. Willie was caught 3 times for robbing banks, and finally the judge asked him, he said, "Willie, now why is it that you keep on robbing banks? You know you get caught every time." And Willie said, "Because that's where the money is." Who can dispute that? And yet the reality of bank robbing is more complicated than the answer that Willie gave. The same is true for the theme of this assembly. Hope for the world, the gift of family. It is more complicated than it first sounds. It may be true or sound like a good idea, but finding the truth of it takes a little time, especially in the unexpected circumstances which face us this weekend. The pain and the loss which this family is feeling and suffering right now. Family and relationships are always sensitive topics to talk about. We've all had mixed experience in our families. And it may be an especially hard time to talk about family and relationships in this assembly. I realize that. But perhaps that is all the more reason for us to explore God's gift of family, how it can sustain and strengthen us, even when it hurts to see that gift so challenged by circumstances that are hard to understand. When I first thought seriously about this theme, I wasn't sure it was true at all. After 53 years in 3 different families, my family of origin, the family I married into, and my own nuclear family, my wife and 2 children, most of which, by the way, has been positive, let me add, the first thing that comes to my mind as humanity's hope is not the gift of family. The gift of family is sometimes like garlic, you know. It's the gift that keeps on giving, whether you want it to or not. There's good reason for the old saying that you can choose your friends, but you're stuck with your relatives. I must have gone to 10 reunions on both sides of my wife's family. She was blessed with a large family. I was blessed with a small family. I must have gone to 10 reunions before I realized that in the Bible there was no 11th commandment which said, you shall go to all family reunions whether you want to or not. Nevertheless, I do believe the assembly theme has important truth in it if we define the terms and if we ponder the theme so that we get below the obvious. And I will attempt to do that now in 2 parts. First, today, I will try to define the gift. What is family? What is family that makes it a potential hope for the world? Is the family in crisis? In what sense is it a gift? And where does the family fit in the spectrum of all God's gifts? Then tomorrow, I'll try to clarify the hope. What about the family makes it hopeful for the future? What is the role of the family in God's hope for the world? Is the church a family in any hopeful sense of the word? Besides the fact that, like families, there are usually a lot of fights in the church. Why should the church invest in families? So here we start. Today, first of all, defining the gift. What is family? Now, most popular talk about the family, I think, has in mind married with children. Wife and husband who will simultaneously mother and father of 2.5 children, a pet, and a van. It will come as no surprise to you, I'm sure, when I say that the shape of the American family is changing. Most of us have seen it in our lifetime. During the 1980s, the percentage of American nuclear families, almost like the one that I grew up in, a housewife, an employed husband, and 2 children. That kind of family declined by 21% in this country in 1 decade, and that decline is continuing rapidly. There are more and more nuclear families in which the adult woman is the breadwinner, or both parents work outside the home. Driving up here yesterday, I heard a report on public radio about a new book entitled She Works, He Works. And it is a book about couples in which both parents work outside the home. And it reported that 2/3 now of all American women work outside the home. Fortunately, it didn't say how many men actually work inside the home. That would worry me if that percentage has gone up too high. But seriously, 2/3 of all American women work outside the home. And that has changed the shape of American nuclear families. There are plenty of these families now, as you well know, in which only one parent is raising children, or no children are present, or one or more grandparents are present. And once we move beyond parents and children, then we're into extended family, which all of us have, sometimes in the same living space, sometimes not, sometimes from our family of origin, sometimes from a family into which we have married. And we haven't yet mentioned households of people who have remarried with and without children, households with adopted children with relationships to both adoptive parents and birth parents, domestic partnerships, same-sex unions, now in some places with qualified legal status. I suppose I could go on. What is family? Obviously, family can take many forms, and those forms can change. And much of that change is determined not by religion or politics, but by economics. What we call nuclear family, is a fairly recent phenomenon in our history. It was made possible mainly by the Industrial Revolution, the division of labor outside the household, and better transportation. People who are related can afford to live farther apart because they can reach each other more easily than they could 100 years ago. For most of Western history, and that includes biblical history as well, the main form of family was the patriarchal household. More than 2 generations lived under one roof, or next door, or down the road, or maybe in the next 5 tents down the pasture with their flocks. And all these people were defined as family by their common connection and allegiance to the male head of the household. This household of the father was even the basic building block of ancient Israel. And in the rest of the Mediterranean world, where Christianity arose and finally thrived, patriarchal households included servants, aunts and uncles, close friends, boarders and renters, sometimes even business partners. And when we get to the Reformation in 16th century Europe, a few more nuclear small families are in evidence, but the typical family was still the household extended family. Now, the household of Martin and Catherine Luther in Wittenberg was not typical in every way. Not many families, for example, were given a monastery in which to live and raise their children. That reminds me, by the way, that 2 weeks ago, 2 of our students at Gettysburg were married to each other in a monastery. A student who had just graduated and a first-year student were married in the cloister at Ephrata, this old mystical community near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I have to tell you that it warmed the heart of a Reformation historian to see 2 future clergy married to each other in a monastery. But to get back to the Luther household in Wittenberg, it's clear that it was not typical in all kinds of ways. It's even true that Catherine might have managed the household, that it might have been more of a matriarchal than a patriarchal household. But in one way it was typical. Under one roof, under one big roof, a lot of different people ate and slept. In addition to the 6 children, only 4 of whom survived their parents, so did a lot of various students and friends live there. Catherine's aunt Magdalena lived there in the Luther household, and even a few theological enemies came to stay from time to time. Relatives, family members of John Agricola and Andrew Karlstadt, former colleagues of Luther with whom he had serious theological agreements. When they got into trouble, Luther actually took them into his household. Well, you knew if you ask a historian, you get a mini history lesson, and I'm not going to bore you with any more of that. But the reason I'm subjecting you to this little history lesson is to make the point that families have not always been the same. Families have changed. The forms of families have changed, and that change should not surprise us. There's no one sacred form of family. Extended, nuclear, large household, patriarchal, matriarchal, once married, never married, remarried. If family is a gift, that gift does not come in the same pretty package all the time. We're past the time, as that report indicated yesterday, of the idealized nuclear family. Ozzie and Harriet have gone away, and they probably will never return. So what is the gift of family that makes it potentially a hope for the world? If it's not the form of the family, what is it that all families have in common that gives it a hopeful character and makes it a gift? The gift of family is connectedness. Connectedness. The gift of family is being connected with other people. People who have invested in long-term relationships with one another. People who care for one another no matter